shootouts and things. Nobody's going to stop the process and so on. But then you come into this range of services, the ones I mentioned that people have prioritized, education, health, sanitation, the ones that are historically missing or limited or low quality. These are all government-provided, tax-paid public services. These are also all public services that help people improve their quality of life so that they, for example, can get a better job, so they have better quality of life, so they want to pay taxes, so that they are capable of paying fees for services and so on. And then maybe around 5 years you'd get here. So I put housing down here, mostly access to building supplies, technical support, because that's where people have been investing for generations, is in their homes. So this isn't where you really need to focus. This is where you need to focus. But then once about 5 years, then you go into this set of services for public interventions, which are the market-based or oriented consumer-paid services. Things like improving utilities, water, electricity, and having people pay for those utilities. Local business formalization. So the motor taxi drivers who currently operate informally, you come in, they have to pay tax on their business, things like that. And eventually land titling. We're looking at things like community land trusts, but regardless, it can be outright land titling. Whatever it is, it needs to be done in this kind of, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Now, it's important to do this order because here you're building the capacity to pay, right? And you're ensuring they can take advantage of the development that comes, and you're avoiding exploitation. Now, just note, water, electricity, and so on, they exist already. It's a question of improving them and eventually having people being able to pay for those services. So I'll come back to the slide later. Right now I'm going to talk a little bit about present-day Rio. I'm going to go pretty quickly through these. This is 5 years since the Olympic decision. In fact, it was this week, 5 years ago, when Rio was announced to host the Olympics in 2016. So before about then, these are estimated dates, we've had a whole bunch of things that changed, basically, right? So the economy was stagnant. Today it's the third in Brazil. Immigration was slowing, been growing fast the last few years. Lost capital city and industry status in the previous decades to São Paulo and Brasília. Now we're receiving double the international investment of São Paulo. There was little political will, a fragmented populist government, and now we have strong political will, a lot of market-oriented government, a lot of local, state, federal cooperation, seamless between the levels. That was not the case. And there was lack of trust in Rio as a city to be able to manage itself. But then all of a sudden, of course, we got the Olympics, World Cup final, so there was a sense that Rio could now be up to the task. And what hasn't changed, and we'll get back to this as well, is inequality. So in previous Olympic cities, you can see there was a party put on by the state, everybody went. The last 20 years, Rio had, no developing country had been selected to host the World Cup. The Olympics. So this was a big deal. The city government has invested a lot of money in marketing itself. This is a 9-page spread, was taken out in Foreign Affairs magazine. You can see the publicity that's been generated. This was around 2010. This was a Rio Negócios, which is the new city-sponsored website to encourage and support international investment in Rio. Rio's gone to being one of the most expensive cities in the world. This was 23 in 2011. It's now number 11. It's not only number 11 now, but it's the city whose cost of living has gone up the highest in the entire world in the last 6 years. We've had an 86% increase in the cost of living over these years. This is mostly based on rent and housing. IBM, we have an IBM control tower that oversees everything from traffic to crime and weather. We've seen a massive rebranding exercise. The city government went from an annual marketing budget of 600,000 reais in 2009 to 89 million now. And you can see the kind of change. This was an ESPN piece a few years ago. This is what the city was trying to project. The New York Times went with this. This was late 2009, late 2010, a year apart. Front page stories in the New York Times. This was a period around 2010 of this glowing revival of Rio. The Olympics video, it's beautiful, but very strong marketing piece for the city. And a lot of the city's publicity around its public interventions in favelas were initially very positive. So these are all projects that the city was going to do or was doing on behalf of the poor in Rio, in favelas in particular. So there was things like the PAC, the libraries, the gondolas, the public housing, the Mora Carioca. I'll talk quickly about a couple of these now. So the Growth Acceleration Program, this is actually a federal investment program from the federal government. Started under Lula, the previous president, 2008-ish, maybe a little before, no, I think it's 2008. It's in infrastructure investments all over Brazil. In the favelas in particular, in Rio, they've been emphasizing different interventions. There's a long participatory process where residents are asked to give their opinion about what should happen in their city, in their community. In the end, though, what they've been building is attractive. You can see they're all visually attractive projects, but not necessarily what communities want. So what's happened is communities are starting to not want this program. In the case of Rocinha, they're actually saying they don't want the investments because the city wants to build a gondola there. This gondola here was built in Alemão, and the community is now suing the government because what they wanted was sewage, sanitation. So in their public participatory process, it was very clear that sanitation was the preference of residents, but then the government came in with the gondola, used the public resources for this project instead, and has not done the sanitation. So the community's suing. And in Rocinha, which is another favela, they're actually now fighting the gondola altogether, saying the same thing. We want sanitation. So this program, this is kind of how it's panned out. Some of the projects have been useful. This is a very important public housing development in an area that had very high tuberculosis rates. So this has helped in that particular setting, and people were removed and brought back to the same location. They weren't forced to move far away. Moving far away is the emphasis, is what happens as a result of this program. So this is also a federal program. It's called Minha Casa Minha Vida. We have an expert, a local expert on this in the back, Meg, who's doing her research on Minha Casa Minha Vida. And it's Brazil's first large-scale affordable housing program. So this was, like I said, 100 years of favelas, and all of a sudden, finally, the government is going to do something about public housing. We currently have the idea with the plan is to build 7 million units nationwide. Okay, 66,000 have already been delivered in the state of Rio. Now, this program has been characterized by poor construction, small units. They're distant. They're up to 2-3 hours away from central areas where opportunities are and so on. They're very strict rules. They're almost the opposite of a favela. In the favela, there are very flexible rules. You can start a business. You can have pets. You can have wild, you can have chickens. You can, in public housing, you can't have a dog. You can't sell or leave for 10 years. You can't have a business. You're not allowed to hang your laundry here, but you also don't have a laundry facility in your home. So they haven't been very well designed, basically. And the maintenance has been, not only maintenance isn't very good, the quality of the construction is very poor. So this is an example of a unit in Niterói across from Rio, where they had invested 19 million reais, and then before it was even launched, huge cracks appeared, and they had to demolish the whole thing. The Pacifying police units is the main program that's gotten a lot of international publicity in the media. This is a state program, because the military police is a state institution. The police in Rio are internationally known for being some of the most violent police in the world, a lot of corruption in the police force, the formation of militias, which are off-duty police who extort money and engage in criminal activity. So we have some of the most problematic policing in the world. So this was an attempt to reform that. It was our first major attempt at reforming the police in Rio. It started in late 2008, and it involves getting new recruits, young officers who haven't yet been corrupted, paying a little more, having more female officers, some humanitarian training, and placing them permanently as community police force in favelas. The very first operations of this seemed very successful. People were very, very hopeful. People in these communities were very glad to have the change. There's the case of Santa Marta in particular, which has gotten good publicity. Vidigal has also been a more successful case. But as the program has evolved, there was this very quick attempt to scale it out. And the quality dropped very quickly. And what we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 5 years is the drop to the point where it's almost, there's almost no difference between the new Pacifying police units installed in favelas and the traditional military police. The only difference is they're permanently there. So residents are living under this in a very tense situation. And in one favela, they installed the army. So they've taken the level of, to an extreme. And a lot of this is because these big mega events are coming to Rio and they feel a need to control these communities at all costs. In the communities where this program has been better implemented, especially Vidigal, but others in the south zone of Rio, the wealthier area, it's triggering gentrification. So what happens there is the police come in and all of a sudden you create this safe place. It's a great location. Those favelas tend to be more developed because people there had more access to jobs and opportunity. And then all of a sudden, new people are moving in. There's even a 4-star hotel in Vidigal. And yeah, I mentioned the recent violence, escalating violence, but the amount of police abuse and torture has been increasing and very visible. We've had to report many cases, unfortunately, especially in the last year. UPP Social was supposed to be the twin program to the Pacifying police. So the police would come in, and the social program would come in with it, and social workers and others would go around the community finding out what was needed in terms of investments and whether it was water, sanitation, electricity improvements, whether it was education, healthcare, all those things we discussed earlier, and those were supposed to be implemented. What's actually happened is they collect the data, then they go back, put it all on maps, make it available, you can access it online, but that's it. The information doesn't translate into policy. And then finally there's the Morar Carioca program. This is a local, city-level favela upgrading program. Upgrading is when you take a favela and you say, okay, well, it's established here, how do we bring in all the missing infrastructure? So, you know, the roads, improve the roads, make sure there's bicycle infrastructure, transport infrastructure, make sure there's a clinic, the right number of clinics and schools for that population, all those kinds of things, integrated into this formal city. This program was supposed to build on the Favela Bairro program I mentioned earlier that had invested in over 100 favelas in the 90s and was going to upgrade all the favelas by 2020. This was one of the Olympic legacy projects that the mayor touted. Unfortunately, because this is a beautifully written program, if it had been implemented, it could have been a revolution and an example for many cities around the world. What happened is the program never really got implemented. It was only implemented in the year of 2012, which was a mayoral election year. So at the beginning of that year, the resources started coming to the architecture firms so they could start the projects and develop the local NGO that was doing all the evaluations and working with residents to create good projects. But as soon as the elections were over, within 3 months, the funds were cut. So essentially, it looked like an electioneering strategy. How do we get, we look like we're doing the right thing before the election. And what happened is the label continues being used by the city. They say Morar Carioca is in all these different communities. But actually, they're not implementing the original project. They're labeling anything they do in any favela with this label because it got a positive, it was like a positive brand. So even evictions are being, areas with widespread evictions are being labeled Morar Carioca. So what all these projects have in common is that these government programs is that they're actually really well written. They're built on a lot of knowledge and learning, but the implementation is the same old kind of logic that has permeated policy for decades. There's a TED Talk you can see by the mayor of Rio a couple years ago, where he says, the city of the future has to be socially integrated. Favelas are part of the solution. So it's, again, 89 million reais a year on marketing, and unfortunately, this is part of that. So the last 5 years, we've been tracking, working with community journalists, community reporters, residents, looking at opinions, what's going online. All of that is reported. You can check it out on Rio on Watch on Facebook, Twitter, as well as the actual Rio on Watch. So we've been watching changes happen. This is, Rio on Google. The city is all of this here. Okay? This tourist area is this area here, just to give you a sense of the scale. You can see the large urban forest in the middle of the city. Okay, the ocean. These are the different zones of Rio. The central area where it first founded. The south zone where the city spread, wealthier areas. The north zone, which was the industrial area. And then the west zone, which is just the last few decades, has been developing. So in 2010, when we started our community journalism, our social media trainings, community journalism trainings, we started getting reports from communities across our network, and then we started documenting them on Rio on Watch. The first evictions, the first time evictions were published in English was this story on Rio on Watch, which was picked up later by major media. This was on our Rio on Watch YouTube channel. It was picked up by Associated Press. We were watching communities debate on their private Facebook walls for a long time before the protests of 2013 and everything kind of became visible. And this is an example from a community journalist, J.V. Santos. He published a post about an eviction happening across the city, something he would never have known about a couple of years prior, right? Before social media, the web, before all this access we have now. So all of a sudden you have a kid, a young guy, 20-ish, from the north zone of Rio, publishing a story about an eviction happening an hour and a half away. Within an hour, you had a 115 comment thread, all by young people from around his neighborhood in the north zone, all talking policy, debating what was happening in the city. This was in 2011 already. This has only increased. Now the mainstream media started picking up. 6 months after that Metro eviction, we reported on the early Rio on Watch site. The Guardian wrote about it. Al Jazeera wrote about it. That particular eviction has drawn out to be one of the most it ended up being the most drawn out eviction we've had in Rio. Early last year, we took CNN journalists, photographer, and folks from Australian TV out to cover this eviction. As a result of the journalists being there, the families that were still holding out had their compensation offer go up from 6,000 reais to 45,000 reais on the course of a day. Just to show kind of the importance of the international visibility. They actually affect the day-to-day and longer term. I just want to pass this around. This is a photographer that we collaborated with from New York, or he's German, lives in New York, came to Rio, and we introduced him to a number of people going through eviction situations who he interviewed and profiled in the book. We're watching evictions to this day. This is happening right now. So this started in 2010, this new evictions phase in Rio. It continues now. This is an example of what you see in the local media. This is Globo, the local newspaper, talking about this favela, the largest to be evicted for the Olympics. 900 families from one favela. The article talks about how happy and satisfied they are that they're being moved to public housing. This is what we get from the Brazilian news. Meanwhile, one of our international observers went to a meeting where the community is quickly trying to organize against the eviction, at least a subset of residents. We were the first to kind of see gentrification starting to happen in favelas. This was the first story anywhere about gentrification in favelas. Later, mainstream media picking up all over, whether it was Rio or NPR, local, national, international news, The Guardian. Financial Times went as far as recommending people buy in the favelas, right? A buying guide, this is late last year, comparing 100,000 pounds, you get several 3-bedroom concrete houses in Vidigal. For 500,000 pounds, a 2-bedroom apartment in Ipanema. And 1 million, a family townhome in Copacabana. And we see this kind of logic, right? Starting to hit the international press. Land titles sound like a great thing. They might be in some situations, but when you're living in the hottest property market, or one of them in the world, there's no affordable housing market at all other than the favelas. You start giving out land titles, especially if it's full-on private property, individual titles, at that moment, you're going to create a huge social problem in the medium term. We're seeing this is a map done by Federal University of Rio City Planning Department of people's relocations from the purple areas to the yellow. Remember I showed you the west zone, the newest area of Rio. And then meanwhile, we're seeing a number of new occupations. So with this crazy housing market, there's no regulation at all, there's not enough public housing, and so on. We're seeing new favelas being occupied, new buildings being occupied, and so on. In the meantime, the future Olympic village of Rio is going to turn into a luxury neighborhood after the Olympics, publicly funded in part because it's going to be the Olympic village. This neighborhood is going to be larger than Leblon, for those of you who know Rio. It's actually not a neighborhood, it's a gated community. It's going to be larger than one of Rio's elite neighborhoods. They also got LEED neighborhood development certification, which is highly questionable in this case, and we can talk about that if anybody's curious about that later. This is the Gini coefficient for Brazil, is the green. Brazil has managed to go against international trends and reduce its inequality since 2001. This is due to federal support and so on. Brazil was the most unequal country in the world when I was your age, when I was in college. Now it's 17th. Okay? So we've moved, this is the Brazilian rate. Now, Rio metro area is blue. So while the federal programs are actually bringing inequality down, there are local pressures pushing it up. And meanwhile, I've talked about the police. We have some of the most violent police forces in the world. This is a picture during a protest, and this is a kid, when residents were protesting someone else being killed by the police. So we went through this earlier, right? The recipe for integration. This is what we see as kind of a way to work through and integrate the communities with public services that are missing. So what's actually happening is that we've seen the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. When we start with security increases, the rents go up immediately, and about 20 to 30% of favela residents rent on average. So those people are almost immediately priced out of their community. Then utilities, within a week, in most favelas that the police arrive with the UPP program, within a week they come around and start saying, okay, now you're paying for electricity, now you're paying for cable, now you're paying for water, all these different services. Not giving people time to prepare, sometimes they give subsidized rates, sometimes those there were a series of articles on Rio Watch where people were getting these enormous bills, they made no sense. There's a local university, in fact, legal unit investigating this because it looks like there's something's wrong, right? So we've got this process where people are being priced out, formalizing businesses, you have to pay taxes, sure, but people aren't prepared to do that. Going all the way through, by the time we even get here, and some communities receiving title early in this process, by the time we get here, we're not even going to need these because we're going to be talking about a whole different population benefiting from this, right? So the question is, we want to develop places for the people who live there, not places irrespective of that, and then you have new people and then you push the problem elsewhere. And this is really the big problem with gentrification. So what we have going on in Rio is the government is actively funding the gentrification process in Rio's favelas under the guise of poverty alleviation. Now, it's important, I'll just take a quick moment. We've been doing research looking at cities in different parts of the world, what they do about affordable housing and affordability in general, because it turns out there seems to be a number around 20 to 30% where every major city has to subsidize. So there's always a 20 to 30% people who cannot afford to live in a city, okay, at the market rate. They can't afford the housing, they can't afford the utilities. That's why New York City has 10% public housing, has rent control still on a large portion of the city. There are all these efforts to do inclusionary zoning, pluses and minuses in that process. In Zurich, 30% live in co-ops. In London, 24% get social rent in addition to public housing. In Santiago, Chile, 20% get housing from the government. In Asia, it's even higher rates. So in Asia, it's like 49% in Hong Kong, 90% in Singapore. We're talking about most developed cities know that there's a percentage of population, often the people who are building the city, right? But who need some sort of subsidy because the market doesn't build for them. We don't have that in Rio. So this is the process that is unraveling as a result of not being aware of that. So now I'm going to go into the final section of the presentation and talk about favelas as a sustainable model. Taking the leap to thinking of these communities. Now first people tend to think, oh, slums, they shouldn't exist in the first place. Why do we have this? It's awful. Although now it turns out that a third of the urban population, oh, for those who have to leave real quick, there's a little clipboard where you can put your email if you want to get our monthly Rio on Watch digest, or just take my card, it's in the back of the room. Okay? And this is the address for the film that I'll show later for anybody who wants to check it out on YouTube later. It's Favela Modelo, bit.ly. Okay, so just recognizing that there's these communities have existed in this case for over 100 years. Worldwide, 1/3 of people live in informal settlements in urban. One-third of urban humanity already lives in informal settlements. By 2050, it's going to be 1/3 of all humanity. So human population, that's where human population is growing in the world today. It's growing in these kinds of communities. So when we think of them as places that shouldn't even exist, we're not dealing with 1/3 of humanity, and we're not going to effectively deal with that, right? Not only that, but then through our work, we found there are actually a whole bunch of qualities in these places. And then now, talking with architects and designers and people involved in sustainable development, finding that actually that we might be able to leapfrog and we might be able to create something new if we start thinking of these communities in a more creative way. So, even in Rio, we already have a number of examples of communities that are already internalized naturally the concept of these becoming sustainable communities. Whether it's in Sichie, this was an area between the levels. That was not the case. And there was lack of trust in Rio as a city to be able to manage itself. But then all of a sudden, of course, we got the Olympics World Cup final. So there was a sense that Rio could now be up to the task. And what hasn't changed, and we'll get back to this as well, is inequality. So previous Olympic cities, you can see there was a party put on by the state. Everybody went. The last 20 years, Rio had no developing country had been selected to host the World Cup. The Olympics. So this was a big deal. The city government has invested a lot of money in marketing itself. This is a 9-page spread, was taken out in Foreign Affairs magazine. You can see the publicity that's been generated. This was around 2010. This was a Rio Negócios, which is the new city-sponsored website to encourage and support international investment, shootouts and things. Nobody's going to stop the process and so on. But then you come into this range of services, the ones I mentioned that people have prioritized, education, health, sanitation, the ones that are historically missing or limited or low quality. These are all government-provided, tax-paid public services. These are also all public services that help people improve their quality of life so that they, for example, can get a better job, so they have better quality of life, so they want to pay taxes, so that they are capable of paying fees for services and so on. And then maybe around 5 years you'd get here. So I put housing down here, mostly access to building supplies, technical support, because that's where people have been investing for generations, is in their homes. So this isn't where you really need to focus. This is where you need to focus. But then once about 5 years, then you go into this set of services for public interventions, which are the market-based or oriented consumer-paid services. Things like improving utilities, water, electricity, and having people pay for those utilities. Local business formalization. So the motor taxi drivers who currently operate informally, you come in, they have to pay tax on their business, things like that. And eventually land titling. We're looking at things like community land trusts, but regardless, it can be outright land titling. Whatever it is, it needs to be done in this kind of, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Now, it's important to do this order because here you're building the capacity to pay, right? And you're assuring they can take advantage of the development that comes, and you're avoiding exploitation. Now, just note, water, electricity, and so on, they exist already. It's a question of improving them and eventually having people being able to pay. Investment in Rio. Rio's gone to being one of the most expensive cities in the world. This was 23 in 2011. It's now number 11. It's not only number 11 now, but it's the city whose cost of living has gone up the highest in the entire world in the last 6 years. We've had an 86% increase in the cost of living over these years. This is mostly based on rent and housing. IBM, we have an IBM control tower that oversees everything from traffic to crime and weather. We've seen a massive rebranding exercise. The city government went from an annual marketing budget of 600,000 reais in 2009 to 89 million now, okay, for those services. So I'll come back to the slide later. Right now I'm going to talk a little bit about present-day Rio. I'm going to go pretty quickly through these. This is 5 years since the Olympic decision. In fact, it was this week, 5 years ago, when Rio was announced to host the Olympics in 2016. But before about then, these are estimated dates, we've had a whole bunch of things that changed, basically, right? So the economy was stagnant. Today it's the third in Brazil. Immigration was slowing, been growing fast the last few years. Lost capital city and industry status in the previous decades to São Paulo and Brasília. Now we're receiving double the international investment of São Paulo. There was little political will, a fragmented populist government, and now we have strong political will, a lot of market-oriented government, a lot of local, state, federal cooperation, seamless.